Very grateful to the High Altitude Observatory for hosting the conference. This was a place that was important to Michael for many, many years, long before he became a director here. And of course, I am very grateful to the local staff, and especially to Cheryl, for taking care of all the practical arrangements, something that I would be utterly hopeless at dealing with. So with those words, I'd like to hand over to Cheryl to say a few words about the practical arrangements, and then to Yuri as chair of this session. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad you could join us. I just have a couple of brief sort of housekeeping announcements. The restrooms are in the back of the atrium. As you probably know, prior to your talk, if you could upload your presentation or come up to the podium, the break before your talk, get yourself either on, you can test your own computer or upload it on one of ours, either a Mac or PC, that would be great. Please use the compost bins and the recycle bins. All of our disposable kitchenware is compostable. After the conference, when you leave, if you would please recycle your name badges, I'll leave a box on the registration table. I would appreciate that. And if you have any questions while you're here, need any help, talk to me, Jorn, Steve Tomczak. We'd be happy to help you, and enjoy the conference. Thank you.
Well, our first scientific speaker will be Bill Chapman from the University of Birmingham, speaking about MJT, Michael, and solar and stellar physics.
Great, okay, excellent. So good morning, everyone. It's a real honor to have been asked to give the first talk of this conference commemorating Michael's career. Later in this session, we're going to hear about the legacy he's left, his achievements from his leadership in administration. But I've been asked to cover and provide an overview of his achievements in his research. And of course, that means the legacy of what he's left from the work he did in solar and stellar physics. So where to begin? There is an awful lot to cover, as I think most of you in the audience know. I only have 25 minutes. So what I'm going to do is to pick out some of the key highlights and the key strands and themes from Michael's research career, some of the key milestones as well, some of the most important results that he published or presented. And I hope as well that in doing that, we'll be able to set some ideas running that we'll be able to explore in much greater detail through your talks and also discussions throughout the rest of the week. So the first important thing to say, I think, is that Michael had a very broad range of interest, and this was reflected in the range of different problems and science topics and challenges that he actually addressed and worked on. One thing that I've done to try and sort of capture this is a word cloud of words from titles of papers on which Michael was a co-author. I think you can see this covers not only the sort of the gamut or range of different science areas in solar and stellar physics, but one of the things it does as well, I think, is it captures as well the different ways we go about doing our science, the different sort of methodologies or disciplines within that. And I think it's important to remember that Michael had not only a breadth of interest, but also as well a breadth of expertise. And I think that plays to how we think about the impact of his work, not only through the research results that he published, how that's helped us to better understand the interiors of the sun and other sun-like stars, how they evolve as well over time, but also as well in the way that he actually did his research, the breadth of his expertise. So that was reflected in expertise in theory. He was also someone as well who actually did hands-on stuff with data, actually analyzing data. And when he did that, he didn't just use off-the-shelf analysis techniques that have been developed by other people, he was also involved as well in actually developing methodology too. So Michael as well was someone who really enjoyed working with other people. He had a very broad range of collaborators who I think without fail enjoyed working with him. One way I've tried to capture that, again, courtesy of ADS. So some of you may have mixed views on the new version of ADS, but it does allow you to do things like this. So this is actually capturing Michael's research network, his network of collaborators. So all the names on here are names of scientists who've shared co-authorships on papers. And then the size of the name denotes the number of common co-authorships. So you can see that Jan probably has the longest name, maybe on there. He has the biggest name on here, and I think that's very apt. Jan, along with Douglas, is one of Michael's 2 longest standing collaborators. I'm sure some of you can probably just about pick out your names on here. I think one striking thing about this, I mean, aside from the very, very large number of names on here, I'm sure there are other people in the audience here who will have collaboration networks that are as extensive as this. The thing that I find most striking about this is actually that aside from a few names, a lot of the names actually have a fairly similar size. I think that reflects as well the sort of the breadth of the different variety of people that Michael actually collaborated with. And he was someone who was very, very supportive with collaborators, very supportive in particular with working with young people. So another thing as well that I think came across from speaking with people who worked with Michael was them saying he treated people the same way, irrespective of whether they were a professor or a PhD student. So just a quick snapshot and recap of Michael's career. So beginning here with his PhD, and of course his supervisor in Cambridge was Douglas. Then some postdocs, so a postdoc working with Jan in Aarhus. You can see he spent time as well here in Boulder, also as well in California. He then returned to the UK to take up a prestigious PPARC fellowship at Queen Mary, and that position was then converted to a faculty position. And then he moved on to a chair at Imperial College. From 2004 onwards, his focus shifted towards administration. So again, reflecting the broad range of his interests and his desire to make a difference through, if you like, shaping the landscape through leadership and administration. And we'll hear more about that later on. But beginning with his PhD, when Michael went to Cambridge and started his PhD under Douglas, he joined a very prestigious academic family tree. So there's some pretty impressive names on here. I think there are some people here in the audience who share this family tree, either through Michael having been their supervisor or Douglas as well. So you can see some pretty prestigious names on there. So in his PhD, Michael tackled a variety of different topics, which would lead to the publication of several quite varied papers early on in his career. So I'm going to shift now to talking about some of those early papers, some of the things they set running in terms of the themes of work that he was pursuing. Before that, I thought it would be interesting to have a look at a picture of Michael from early in his career. Now, this is from a conference back in 1989. There are a few other familiar faces on here. Can anyone pick out where is Mike on here? Robin will know because he provided me with the picture. Anyone spot where Mike is? Yes, good spot. So there he is. So I thought, I think when Robin sent me this, I would have, had he not pointed out where his father was, I think I would have struggled. I just wasn't used to, I didn't know Michael before he had a beard. So there he is early on. So let's start to have a look at some of the early publications. This is from one of Michael's first publications, this with Douglas. I decided I just picked out a random page from this, well, not quite random, but almost from this particular paper, just to make the point that throughout his career, he made a significant impact through his work on the theory side. So here's something from very early on. This was a paper calculating the impact of a deeply buried magnetic field on the frequencies and splittings of P modes. So I thought I'd show something with lots of equations that makes me as a naive observer feel quite queasy. So yeah, so he could certainly do the theory. Then actually his first paper that appeared in a refereed academic journal was this one from 1989. I think this one is noteworthy for several reasons. First of all, the two co-authors again, Jan and Douglas, his two longest standing collaborators. You can see from Michael's affiliation here, this was from the time when he was actually working with Jan in Aarhus. The other thing is the topic, inversions. And also as well, the subject of the paper as well, not just on using inversions, but actually developing techniques for doing that. And this is something that where Michael made, I think, a quite important couple of landmark papers that were published from when he actually returned to the UK, to Queen Mary, working with Frank Pipers, and here actually developing techniques for actually doing inversions. So this was on developing a new formulation of the so-called optimally localized averages method of doing inversions and inferring internal structure. The first of these papers is on developing that technique. So for those of you who aren't terribly familiar with the Euler method, as the name implies, so the idea here is that you take sensitivity kernels of individual modes, and then you look to find some optimal combination of those, which will produce what's called an averaging kernel, which will give you information about the structure of your star, be it the sun in this case, in a particular layer within the interior. And usually to do the optimization, what you do is you minimize an integral of the square of the kernel, where that's multiplied by some cost function that penalizes the kernel having significant amplitude away from the target radius, the bit of the star you're interested in getting information on. Now that can be quite computationally intensive. It's certainly a big issue at the time here. So what Michael and Frank realized is that, well, why not approach this in a slightly different way and actually ask the question, why not try and compare your averaging kernel with the kernel you would like to have, a target kernel? So here they proposed a method of actually having a Gaussian function to describe that target kernel. So here then the optimization involves comparing the averaging kernel and the target kernel. You're essentially taking a difference, making a subtraction, hence subtractive optimally localized averages. So the first paper basically introduced the method. The second paper then, which actually has the solar method in the title, what that did then was to provide a prescription and guidance for how to actually make a sensible, informed choice about the actual width of your target kernel, depending upon where you're actually looking in the interior. Guidance that's still used. I remember early in the summer where Sabani at the back there, Sabani and I were talking about inversions, and she's been doing some work on inversion stuff recently and commented about using this guidance and this prescription. So that's stuff that's still being used today. Michael's first lead author paper was also a sole author paper from 1990, actually presenting a rotation inversion. So an inversion for rotation as a function of latitude, inverting Phil Goody's Big Bear data. Again, what I think is noteworthy for this paper, one, again, it's inversions, something that's a common theme in terms of developing methodology there, but also the topic, rotation. I think of all the different science topics, arguably the one that Michael is best known for is the results that he produced throughout his career on rotation. So we wind time forward 6 years to this. I'm sure many of you will remember this. This is a cover of a topical edition of Science magazine from 1996, which presented a collection of first light results from the GONG network. And testament to Michael's now international leadership and established leadership in the field, the paper that actually presented first results on using GONG data to say something about internal rotation and dynamics, that was led by Michael. I'm sure you'll recognize a few of the names on the paper there. So this is the, well, one of the, I was going to say the mini plot, but one of the mini plots from that paper. So what we've got here on the top row is inversions showing the rotation as a function of latitude and depth in the outer envelope. And on the bottom row here, rotation for cuts at different latitude. So on the left-hand side, results from the Euler method, and on the right-hand side from the regularized least squares method, the other main method that's used. So what these results showed really nicely was, first of all, rotational shear just beneath the surface, and then showing that transition from differential rotation in the outer envelope to something like solid body rotation in the deep interior, with much greater clarity and fidelity than had been possible before. So just to, before we leave rotation behind, I just wanted to show three more results, three more papers, again, reflecting the diversity of work Michael did on rotation with colleagues. These are all papers that appeared in high impact journals, starting with this one. So I don't know whether Rachel is going to talk about rotation. I don't know whether she might mention this later in her talk. So here, Rachel was the lead author. So what Rachel, Michael, and collaborators did here was looking at changes in rotation against some average profile as a function of time in regions just below and above the tachocline, and also at different cuts in latitude as well. So you can see here on the left-hand side, we've got results for different latitude cuts just above the base of the convective envelope, and on the right-hand side, just below. What was noteworthy about this paper is you can see at the lower latitude, something that sort of looks like a sort of quasi-periodic signature. And if you actually look and phase the regions above and below the base of the convective envelope, it looks like there's a signal there that's an antiphase. So this sort of quite intriguing, maybe suggesting some maybe sloshing backwards and forwards of angular momentum. Now, this is a controversial result. I wanted to try and wedge in a little bit of a controversial result along the way somewhere. This was controversial at the time. Other people who tried to reproduce the result found it difficult. Also, as well, taking time forward, the signal has maybe gone away, but nevertheless, it is an intriguing result, and it appeared in Science. Another Science paper, this from 2002, here Sergei Vorontsov was the lead author. So again, looking at perturbations as a function of time and rotation. Here is a function of depth and latitude in the outermost layers of the convective envelope. And here showing regions rotating slightly faster or slower than the average. So here the warmer colors, and revealing signatures that correlate very strongly with, probably signatures of, therefore, the dynamo. And then the third of these three papers, this a review from 2003 in Annual Reviews in Astronomy and Astrophysics. So it's quite a big deal to be asked to give one of these, and very apt and very appropriate that Michael was the person who was asked to lead this particular paper and to produce the, if you like, the definitive statement on all that was known about the internal rotation of the sun at the time. And the time I haven't got time to cover everything. I thought it appropriate to devote some time there to talking about rotation. Michael, of course, worked on many other things. So I just wanted to, in the next 4 slides, just give just a few examples of some other noteworthy areas he worked. First of all, 2 examples on working on stellar interiors physics, the physics and processes that go into building solar models. Again, you can see Jan, one of his fellow co-authors on this one. So this was looking at the impact of actually including the effects of diffusion and settling in solar models, and seeing whether or not that would improve agreement with the structure or the sound speed profile inferred from helioseismology, with the result being that if you included diffusion, it did bring things into better agreement with what was observed. Another result on physics. So this one work with Mario. So I don't think Mario's, I think his flight got cancelled. I'm looking, so I'm not sure he's here. So, but Mario and Jan and Michael here, working on using signatures, subtle signatures that we see in the frequencies as a function of overtone number, a subtle periodic signature that's due to the change in stratification at the base of the convective envelope, and using that periodic signature to say something about overshoot at the base of the envelope. And then two results that are, I think, very noteworthy because they come from a time when Michael had already switched gears and was now very much in a situation where he had his hands full with his leadership and administration, but he was still active in science. So here, this was from when he'd moved to Sheffield, and results from local helioseismology, so on time distance methodology, also as well using numerical simulations. So this working with two postdocs from Sheffield at the time, Sergei Zharkov and Sergei Sheliak. And then moving time a bit further forward here to 2010, and involved as well in work on other stars. So this was actually one of the first papers that came out on solar-like oscillators from Kepler. Michael was involved in that work. He was involved in the committee that we had that was overseeing the coordinated work on solar-like oscillators. I remember when I would email to ask for views of the committee, he would always without fail reply, even though I'm sure he was, overburdened with all the responsibilities he had on the administration side. Something very noteworthy about this particular paper, you look where he is in this very long authorship. Okay, you don't appear that high up a paper like this unless you've actually done something hands-on yourself. So quite telling there that even in 2010, with everything else he was doing, he was still able to devote the time and energy to actually work on these wonderful data. So that is a sort of a skim through some of the key themes and some of the key results that he produced. I haven't had time as well to go into talking as well about the leadership he gave on the research side, through not just through involvement in particular research projects, but wider leadership too. So just a mention of three things. First of all, he was someone who had a very, very prominent role as part of the HELAS board. I don't know where Marcus is. Marcus, I'm sure, would attest to that Michael was very, very active in providing leadership through HELAS. Leadership as well through hosting conferences. So he actually hosted, many of you will remember, what I think was quite an important conference in Sheffield back in 2006. That was a conference which happened just on the dawn or just before the dawn of the sort of space age for astroseismology. So just before the launch of CORO. I remember at that meeting as having early discussions about the coordinated work that was going to happen with Kepler, as well through Jan and Hans Kjeldsen having set up the Kepler Astroseismic Science Consortium. So that was a very important meeting for that reason. And then finally, just to mention from a UK perspective, Michael's importance and prominence as well for the UK astronomy community. And in particular, he was a very, very important leader as well for the UK solar physics community as well. So where I want to finish, again, as I think many of you know, latterly Michael had been trying to get and was getting much more research active once more. In 2017, several of us received an email that had arisen out of discussions he'd had, I think, with Rafa and also with Jan, I assume, as well, to propose doing this project. So this is from the email. He says, a group of us met recently and discussed galvanizing an effort among an inclusive list of peak baggers, that's people who extract frequencies from the data, and inverters, the people who would use those data to infer the rotation profile of the sun, to get a best possible set of splittings data and revisit the classical rotation inversions of the sun. So Michael had started that research project. Of course, sadly, he wasn't able to finish it. I think it's very appropriate that Jan took over the leadership of that. And I think the results that come out of that project will serve as a fine testament and legacy to his research career. And that's where I'll finish. Thank you.
Will you entertain some questions or remarks?
Sure.
And perhaps Jan would begin by saying, how is that project going?
Well, slowly, but it's going. We have monthly meetings discussing the results. We're beginning to put together a paper. first paper, and we'll see where we get to. Certainly a lot of promise, and of course there's an awful lot of data that we haven't really properly analyzed so far. So, but these are busy people, so we'll get there. And Rachel, of course, is going to say more about that in her talk later in this meeting.
We're, of course, reflecting upon Michael's achievements, but it's also a major opportunity to discuss what is happening now, what is coming next. It's in that sense really a scientific meeting. And that, I think, is a very appropriate way to reflect upon the impact of anyone in the sciences. May I now turn to Rekha Jain? Thank you very much, Bill.
We get this picture of Michael up, maybe? Anyway, good morning, everyone. And it's a great pleasure and an honor for me to be here. And it's so great to see so many of Michael's friends and colleagues, and of course, his beloved wife, Kate, and son, Robin. Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Jim Hurl, and I had the great privilege of working with Michael since he came to NCAR back in 2010. I'd like to begin by thanking indeed the scientific organizing committee, the local organizing committee, Cheryl, who's in the back, all the people that put this together. I know this is quite an effort, but it's just a fantastic opportunity over the next 2.5 days to celebrate together as a set of Michael's friends and colleagues, his science and his professional achievements. I know that he would greatly enjoy talking about the science. He probably would not enjoy as much having the spotlight shined on him, but it's fantastic that we could all come together. My relationship with Michael is, I guess, relatively recent compared to many of you in the room here this morning. I got to know Michael really less than a decade ago. When he came to NCAR, he has, as you saw in Bill's talk, he has a history with NCAR. But when he came to NCAR and accepted the appointment to be the director of the High Altitude Observatory here. And with that appointment, he also became what is termed an associate director of NCAR, which means that he played a very fundamental role on the highest level of management at the center, the executive committee, and was tasked with not only the leadership of the High Altitude Observatory, but really setting the overall direction for the program at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. And when Michael came, he began to work, as we've already heard, an incredible work ethic, incredible amount of intelligence to not only strengthen the High Altitude Observatory internally, but also externally, enhance the visitor program, enhance relationships with the broader community, build stronger connections to universities, and enhance collaborations really with the whole solar and geospace research community. But he also began to work very hard to build connections between HAO and the other laboratories at NCAR. And that's really how I got to know Michael. Because shortly after Michael came to NCAR to lead the High Altitude Observatory, I was appointed the director of something that was called the NCAR Earth System Laboratory. And therefore, I also joined the NCAR Executive Committee and began to work with Michael and others on that committee. But Michael and I really hit it off. We really liked one another. We complemented one another. I had an immediate respect for many of Michael's attributes that we've heard about already here today. And the price that I paid for that was that just about 2 years later, early in 2013, Michael encouraged me to apply to become the director of the National Center. And he's a hard guy to say no to. We had this conversation at a pub in Washington, D.C., across from the National Science Foundation, enjoying a pint together. And he sprung this on me and was very compelling and very convincing. But at least I had enough wits to say that I'll consider applying, but only if you guarantee that if I get this position, you will come with me into the NCAR directorate and become the deputy director of NCAR, as well as the chief operating officer of NCAR. And indeed, that's what happened. So beginning in September of 2013, Michael and I were in the directorate here at NCAR, and I had the opportunity to work with him side by side on a daily basis. And many of the things that we've heard in the opening talks today, I got to witness firsthand. I got to experience his wit, his astonishing intellect, a work ethic that was truly unsurpassed in my experience. But more important than any of that, what we've already heard about today, how deeply Michael cares about people, regardless of their role in this organization. He cared deeply. He was warm, he was generous, and with all of those work responsibilities, always took the time to take an interest in his friends, in his family, just an incredible person to work with. So I was really blessed because I got to know Michael Thompson, not only a world-leading scientist and a terrifically talented administrator, but the person that he was. And for that, I will be eternally grateful. All of you are very familiar with Michael's scientific career. We used to joke in the office that I was not an expert in his field of research. So whenever we would give, for instance, town hall presentations on accomplishments across the National Center, Michael would always have to really tutor me on what to say about the accomplishments of the HAO staff. But with your patience, I want to share just a few of my own thoughts about Michael's scientific career, because I do know, as a scientist myself, it was a remarkable career with distinct and exceptional accomplishments, advancing the understanding of the structure and the dynamics of the solar interior. Although it was difficult to really know Michael's accomplishments in that field because he was so humble, and he often didn't talk about those in his role here at NCAR. But a few years ago, I had the opportunity to lead a nomination for Michael to become a fellow of the American Geophysical Union. And several of you in the audience, I think, helped with that nomination. Now, to be elected a fellow of AGU is a really special tribute, reserved for those who have made truly exceptional scientific contributions and attained acknowledged eminence in the Earth and space sciences generally. In fact, this designation is conferred on less than 0.1% of AGU members in any given year. Now, in my experience, many scientists, many faculty members are very happy to sit down with you and explain the brilliance of their work and all of their accomplishments. And that, of course, is what I needed from Michael to put together a compelling nomination. But that turned out to be one of the most challenging things I've ever done in my career, getting Michael to explain the real impact of his work, again, because of his humility. Now, in his defense, as I've said, I'm a weather guy, I'm a climate guy. Maybe he got tired of trying to explain his science to me. But we ultimately succeeded, and Michael was named a fellow of AGU in 2015. And reading the citation from that award, he was awarded fellowship for his seminal advances in understanding the structure and dynamics of the solar interior through the application of helioseismology. Now, as part of this nomination, of course, I highlighted the fact that Michael had a very strong and influential publication record with many leading solar physicists as co-authors, and we've seen some of that in Bill's talk here this morning. In fact, at that time, which was about 5 years ago, Michael had 25 of his papers that had been cited at least 100 times, and he had more than 10,000 citations for his body of work at that point in time, a little more than 5 years ago. But this presented another challenge to preparing a nomination for Michael, because you see, Michael was insistent on typically listing the authorship in alphabetical order, even though his last name ended or started with a T, which is near the end of the alphabet. And of course, when you think about these review committees for AGU, they're looking for lead author or second author or things like that. So he was frequently not the first author on some of his most important contributions. But the reason that I mention this is because to me, it's really a beautiful, beautiful example of the kind of person that Michael was. In my experience with Michael, working side by side with him for a decade, he never sought the spotlight. He just simply did not seek the spotlight, even when it came to his own research. He was always much more motivated by and interested in helping others achieve success. He cared so deeply about everyone that he worked with. And it was this unselfish strength combined with his passion, his courage, uncompromising integrity, and a really amazing intellect that made Michael the person that he was, that made Michael the person that really blessed all of our lives. He was an outstanding scientist here at NCAR, an outstanding senior scientist. He was a director of the High Altitude Observatory, did terrific things for HAO, and you'll probably hear a little bit more about that later today from Scott McIntosh. As I mentioned, he was the chief operating officer and the deputy director for NCAR. He was far more than just a leading scientist in his field. He was just an amazing administrator, understood all aspects of this organization, and I'm sure other organizations that he was part of. And he also served as interim president for UCAR, which oversees the management of NCAR. He would step in wherever he was needed, and he would do an outstanding job. I was just reflecting, and I was sharing with Robin last night, that when I think about all of this, sometimes one of the most obvious things that just skips my mind is that Michael did all those things here in Boulder in less than a decade. In less than a decade. It's really amazing. He was deeply, deeply devoted to this organization, to the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and the entire staff. As I said, it doesn't matter what job of the 800 or so staff members at NCAR, in all various job categories, Michael cared equally about everyone, and he knew everyone, and everyone could come up and speak with Michael. He took great joy from his work with colleagues across this organization on a wide range of topics and issues. And no matter the size or the complexity or the difficulty of the challenge at hand, administratively, business systems, operating systems, or scientific challenges, Michael was always calm and collected. He was simply unflappable. And you knew that Michael would find a solution to the problem at hand. And I saw firsthand that often his solutions were transformative in nature. Over our 5 years together in the directorate, they were, without question, the highlight of my 28-year career here at NCAR. Personally, he was probably my strongest ally, but he was also my most honest critic. He didn't hesitate to tell me the truth. We talked on a daily basis, as you might expect, even if that truth was uncomfortable. But it was because of this that nearly every decision that I made in my leadership here at the National Center was improved as a result of my discussions and my dialogue and the input from Michael. Michael was always a very steady and a reassuring voice, and my time working side by side with him, talking on the phone before work and after work, exchanging emails, regardless of what time zones we were in, are times that I will cherish my whole life. But what I keep coming back to is how much better off this organization is as a result of Michael's career here, as short as it was. And in closing, Despite this incredible working relationship that I had the privilege of sharing with Michael, what was more important to me by far was Michael's friendship. I miss him terribly, but his legacy will live on forever in me and in many of you that are here today to celebrate his career and his scientific, his administrative, his technical accomplishments. Certainly his loss is something that still hurts. It always will hurt. It's left a hole in my life, and I'm sure in all of your lives as well. But in his very calm and his intelligent way, I'm sure all of us can sense him urging us onward to continue to advance the science and the scientific frontiers that so greatly impassioned Michael, but also to enjoy life and not to take it for granted, to care deeply about family and friends and enjoy their company. To Kate and to Robin, again, thank you so much for sharing Michael with all of us. He'll never be forgotten. And I just want to personally thank all of you for coming to Boulder and celebrating his career over the next 2.5 days. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Our next phase is Douglas Goff. Douglas sometimes, when he has a 10-minute talk, goes on for about an hour or two as he warms up. But with us, I think it will be about a 10-minute talk because it's a digital version of Douglas. Douglas is unable to travel. He had some major medical issues. He's come around well, but he put together some remarks and reflections on Michael and their relationships, both early and late in different stages of their life. And so we will have Douglas on a big video screen, and he produced that just last week. And we thank Jan for actually organizing this, because what it took to get a talk from him.
Oh, that was easy.
So there is Douglas.
Hello, everyone. I'm very sorry I cannot be with you to help celebrate Michael's life. I certainly would have come had I been able. You will no doubt just have heard from Bill Chapman some aspects of Michael's contributions to science, and from Rekha Jain and Jim Hurrell, his impact on the University of Sheffield and on HAO and NCAR. So I shall just say a few words about the beginning and the end of Michael's scientific career. I begin with his student days. He took a degree in mathematics at the University of Cambridge, but his interests were broader than mere mathematics. And so he left and got to go into industry, the big wide world. But he soon discovered that the big wide world was no less constraining than university, and much less satisfying. So after 2 years, he returned to the University of Cambridge and took a graduate course in mathematics and theoretical physics, part 3 of the mathematical tripos, as it's called. And it was then that I got to know him. He attended a course I was giving in astrophysical fluid dynamics. And it became clear to me very quickly that he was clearly the brightest student in the class and also the most curious. He would accost me at the end of lectures very often to discuss aspects of science that interested him. It also became clear to me the caring side of his personality. I recall one day racing up 4 long flights of stairs to get to the lecture room and encountered him at the door when he expressed some concern by the fact that I was somewhat out of breath. And he counselled me on looking after the state of my heart in future. Michael was a man of vision. He could see quickly, in general, how far to go and how to get there. He had strong views, but unlike many far-sighted, strongly viewed people, he was prepared to adjust them in the light of changing circumstances. I illustrate this by an occasion at the end of an examination he took in Part 3 mathematics. It was an examination that I had set. I should point out that Part 3 mathematics is regarded by many as one of the most difficult, if not the most difficult, course there is. And I had the reputation of being one of the most demanding examiners. I was passing by the examination room at the end of the exam in a subject that I had set, and not entirely by accident, and out emerged Michael, red with fury, incensed that he thought he'd done so badly. He shouted at me, telling me he would never talk to me again. In fact, he hadn't done so badly after all. In fact, he came top of the class by a very large margin, and in other subjects too. And so he was awarded the Tyson Medal by the university for being the best student that year in astronomical subjects. Nevertheless, he was more interested in my subject than any of the others he had taken, and resolved to pursue it into research. But he realized that I was the most suitable person to supervise him. So he rescinded his resolve not to talk to me again. Michael was not always right. At the beginning of his research days, I would see him only very rarely. He would come into my office and I would make some suggestions and possibly give him some instructions, and then he would go away. And I'd often have to wait a long time before he returned. What he wanted to do was to wait until he had found what he would regard as a concrete result to come back to report to me. And that wasn't always very easy because one always gets stuck on the way. And then one day he came into my office. This was not long after he had married Kate, and rather sheepishly told me that Kate was insisting that he saw me at least once a week. He feared that I'd be affronted by this request, or was it a demand? And that's where he was wrong. I was absolutely delighted and relieved, and so we quickly arranged times for regular meetings. The outcome of that encounter, however, is that I was now terrified of his wife Kate, whom I'd not yet met. But when we did meet, my fear was dissolved, and together with my wife Roseanne, the four of us became very good friends, and Michael became an independent and excellent scientist and never looked back. I'll tell you another anecdote from this time. There's a prestigious prize in the university that's been awarded annually to the students, to the best student essay, the best young student essay in physics, theoretical physics, and mathematics. It's called the Rayleigh Prize. Now, young is defined by the university in terms of biological age, at least it was at the time, and Michael was not eligible because he had spent 2 years in industry and was now too old. I argued with the university that what mattered under these circumstances was academic age and not biological age, and managed to get the university to change the rules. And Michael repaid me by becoming the first recipient of this prize under the new regulations. I hasten to add, incidentally, that I was not one of the adjudicators of that prize that year. After graduating, Michael went off to do various postdoctoral positions, to hold various postdoctoral positions abroad, and then he returned to England to a tenured position at Queen Mary College and moved on to a professorship at Imperial College. But his interests went beyond the direct science, and so he went to the University of Sheffield to sort out the mathematics. He founded the School of Mathematics, and once he'd done that, he moved to Boulder to become the director of the High Altitude Observatory. in what I think was one of the most difficult financial periods of its existence. Jim Hurrell appreciated this, and Michael was promoted to Deputy Director and Chief Operating Officer of NCAR. In his all too short tenure, he didn't have much time for hands-on research. He was able to facilitate and urge people to do research, and he was very good at that. And in fact, he urged me to look into the seismological consequences of a possible putative black hole in the center of the sun, something that had been suggested by my friend Steve Hawking many decades earlier as a potential solution to the neutrino problem, and which, Michael reminded me, had been a subject of conversation between us while he was a student. Michael wasn't able to do very much directly in that subject, but it was very interesting to listen to talk with him and learn from his insight into some of the most profound aspects of the subject. He also worked on other projects. In particular, he started a big new project on the internal rotation of the sun, with many people involved, which sadly he didn't live to see to fruition. But the project was saved by Jan Christensen Dalsgaard, and it will be reported on by Rachel Howe later in this meeting. I should also say that I was very grateful and honored by Michael, who organized, together with Jan and Sylvie Vauclair, a wonderful meeting to celebrate my 60th birthday in Chateau de Mons in the middle of Armagnac country. Michael had many interests other than science. He was a competent pianist, played the piano just for relaxation. He loved the outdoors, and once he had left London, always lived with Kate in almost isolated houses in the countryside. He loved hiking. He loved carols, local carols in Yorkshire villages. He loved good food and wine, both cooking it and eating it, of course. And later in life, he developed a great affinity for Japan, the country, its culture, and its language, which he was beginning to learn. It was in Japan that he died prematurely, after a harrowing interruption to a 1-month leave of absence that he was to hold in Tokyo to do full-time research. Sadly, that research did not get done. I and many of the rest of us are devastated by the loss of this great colleague who was poised to do many, many more things in the future. But more importantly, to have lost a good friend. My wife, Roseanne, and I are still mourning his passing, and we send out our hearts to Kate and their son, Robin.
Thank you, Douglas. So that's the virtual Douglas. Personality comes across very nicely, and really a loving professional and friendship throughout. We'd like to now change to a slightly different theme so we get some more sense of the family. And then in later sessions, we turn to many more other scientific issues. So Robin Thompson will be the speaker, and his research interests continue in mathematics, but in mathematics slightly different than solar oscillations and things like that, but rather of epidemiology. Fancy word, about as good as helioseismology, but the mathematics of of epidemics and how you may control them. How you control projectors.
That's more challenging, I think. Thanks, Yuri. Hi, everybody. So as you just heard, I'm Robin, I'm Michael's son. I'd just like to start by saying thank you very much to the organising committee and to Cheryl, of course, for arranging this amazing tribute to my dad's life and to his science. He'd be very proud of this. And I'd also like to say thank you for inviting me to give a talk too. I think it's quite a rare opportunity. Not many people get the chance to go and give a talk at a conference dedicated to their dad. So I'm really grateful for that too. It's a great honour, so thank you. So I'm a research fellow at the University of Oxford. It's a 4-year position, and I've started to develop my own research group. So it currently consists of me and 4 PhD students. And we work on using mathematical modelling for forecasting and control of infectious disease outbreaks. So over the last 11 months, we've received a great number of very, very touching and positive comments. This is a kind of selection of a few of them. This is a completely random selection, actually, that I compiled over the last few days. So this is just a few of them, and there were absolutely hundreds. And so I think what this shows is that my dad inspired a huge number of people, and of course, I'm no exception to that. So you're going to hear quite a lot, I guess, in the next 2.5 days about the sun on the left. So I thought I'd instead tell you a bit about the sun on the right. That was what I was told to do anyway. So I actually tried my hand very briefly, saying, that probably happened before, I don't know. Anyway, so I tried my hand very briefly at solar physics. So I took part in the research experience for undergraduates program in Boulder in 2010, just before my parents moved to Boulder. And so I was supervised by Tim Howard at SWIRI, and we ended up writing this paper, which was published just after. But I decided that solar physics wasn't for me in the end. And so I went on instead to work in mathematical biology. And so this is one of the things that I've done recently. I was the guest editor of these 2 special issues of Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society B. In fact, it was my dad's idea to put together a special issue of a journal to coincide with the centenary of the 1918 Spanish influenza pandemic. And so that was what we did. And I was very pleased to be able to dedicate these 2 theme issues to him. And so what I'm going to talk about now is a bit about some of my own research. In particular, I'll talk about the field of infectious disease outbreak modelling. I'll talk about some of the work that I've done on assessing the risk of major outbreaks. And then at the end, very, very briefly, I'm going to talk about a project that I've only just started to work on with Jim Horrell and a couple of other people. And obviously, I'm in no doubt that that project wouldn't be happening were it not for my father. So to start with then, to tell you a little bit about infectious disease outbreak modelling, well, the sort of goal of the field is to observe data from the start of an infectious disease outbreak and then try and make a prediction as to what's going to happen next. And we do that for a range of different systems. So we do that for diseases in humans, like Ebola virus disease up at the top. We also do it for diseases in animals too, like foot and mouth disease, and also for diseases in plants. And so what you see at the bottom is you see an example of citrus greening disease. This is a very devastating disease. It's devastating Florida citrus groves. It's also starting to cause devastation in citrus in California too. So we work on all these types of disease. And so the overall idea of the field then is that we observe data from the start of an outbreak. We then develop a model, a mathematical model, characterizing the underlying epidemiology of the system we're looking at. We then consider the model parameters like the infection rate, and we try and pick values of those parameters that are consistent with the data from the start of the outbreak. And then we use simulations of the model forward, or we use mathematical analysis to try and make a forecast as to what's likely to happen, and to also decide which possible control interventions to enact. And so the kinds of epidemiological models we look at are ones like this. So this is a kind of prototypical compartmental epidemiological model. It's the SIR model, or the susceptible, infected, removed model. And so the idea is that you split your population according to their infection or their symptom status. So in this very basic model, you have 3 types of hosts. So you have individuals that are susceptible to the disease that you're considering, and they would sit in this class S. You also have individuals that are infected by the disease, and they'd be in this class I, and they generate new infections. And then you have individuals that have recovered from the disease and are immune to being infected again, and they would sit in this class R. And you can run simulations of a model like this, and essentially what you do is you flip a coin lots and lots of times, and then each time you flip a coin, you decide what happens. You either decide that one of the susceptible individuals will get infected, or you decide that one of the infected individuals is going to recover. And so you flip a coin lots and lots of times, and the kind of output you get will be something a little bit like this. So this is a graph showing one simulation of this very simple model, and it shows the number of infected individuals and how that changes throughout your simulated outbreak. And then you can extend this if you want to all sorts of different scenarios to include all sorts of different biology. So here are a couple more examples. So the middle one just here is the model that's most commonly used for epidemic forecasting. This is the SEIR model, and it's exactly the same as the model above it, except you have this new E class. And this E class consists of individuals that are infected, but they're not yet infectious, so they're not yet generating new infections. And you can also extend this if you want to include other biology. So at the bottom here, we have a host vector model, so a model which tracks the transmission of a disease from host to vector to host, so something like Zika virus, for example. And so we keep track of the number of susceptible, infectious, and removed humans in the case of Zika virus, and the number of susceptible and infectious mosquitoes too in the case of Zika virus. So this talk's probably a bit different to the rest of the talks in this conference, I guess. But there we go. Okay, so the kinds of questions that we're interested in answering are ones like this. So at the beginning of an outbreak, and I'll talk more about this in a minute, we're interested in things like, are initial cases going to lead on to a massive epidemic, or are initial cases instead going to fade out as a minor outbreak? We're also interested in predicting things like how many cases are there going to be, and which control interventions should be introduced. And then at the end of an outbreak, we're interested in questions like, is the outbreak really over? So just because you can't see any more cases, does that mean that the outbreak's finished, or might the outbreak still be ongoing? Might there still be individuals in the population that are infected, but they're not reporting disease? And so the idea of the theme issue that my dad suggested was to answer all of these questions and to basically commission lots of different research articles to answer kind of each one of these questions in turn. So I'm going to tell you a bit about some of the work that was done on the first of these questions. So in particular, when any pathogen first arrives in a system, what's the risk that it takes off and generates a massive epidemic as opposed to fading out as a minor outbreak? And so as kind of motivation for that question, so this is a figure that was made in 2014. And what it showed at that point is it showed the final size of historical Ebola epidemics. So the total number of individuals infected in each historical Ebola outbreak. And so Ebola survives in animal populations, and then it transitions into humans every few years. And when that happens, one of two things can occur. So either the pathogen can spread from human to human and generate a really large outbreak. So that's what happened in Uganda, for example. In the year 2000, there was this outbreak here, and you can see there were about 450 people that got infected. So that's one option. But the other option is that the first couple of infected hosts either die or recover without infecting anyone else. And then you have a very, very small outbreak, and that was what happened 4 years later. So in, 2004, in the same country, so also in Uganda. So that outbreak saw just one infected host because that host actually survived but didn't infect anyone else. And so the models of the type that I showed you a bit earlier can reflect this sort of behavior. So I showed you this simulation earlier. So this is one simulation of the model. We can run the same model again if we want to, and we might see slightly different behavior, but very, very similar. And the reason that it's very, very similar, but not exactly the same, like I said before, is that it's the result of a sequence of coin flips. So we flip a coin lots and lots of times, and the sequence is very slightly different in this case. So we see a very slightly different outbreak in blue. But if we do exactly the same thing again, under exactly identical conditions, we might see something that looks a little bit different. So in this case, the coin flips were a bit different, and so the pathogen just faded out, and we saw a minor outbreak. And so this kind of matches the data that we saw a bit earlier, that you can either get these very minor outbreaks or these very big epidemics. And so this leads quite naturally onto the idea that there's some risk that a major outbreak happens when a pathogen first arrives in a system. So if you run lots and lots of simulations of your model, and 50% of the time you see something that looks like the blue and the black, and 50% of the time you see something that looks a bit like the red, then that means that the risk posed by that outbreak, so the risk of it becoming a massive epidemic, is about 50%. And so what you can do is you can derive a probability of a major outbreak, so I won't go into any details about this, but you can derive the probability of a major epidemic analytically, and you come up with a very, very simple expression for the probability of a major epidemic when a pathogen first arrives in a system. And this approximation is used a lot. So for example, it was used during the 2014 to 16 Ebola epidemic in West Africa to assess the chance that if the virus went to Nigeria, the chance of then getting a really massive outbreak in Nigeria. So it's really, really important, albeit very, very simple approximation. And so some work that we did in this special issue was looking specifically at something very, very recent. So there's an ongoing outbreak of Ebola in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And recently, the virus went to Uganda. And so there were 2 cases in Uganda. And so we've been looking at trying to assess the chance that the virus would cause a massive outbreak in Uganda as opposed to fading out in that country. And so what we did is we took the standard approximations. This is what I showed you a minute ago. This is the probability of a major epidemic. So if you have a very, very transmissible pathogen, then there's a very high probability of a major epidemic. If you have a much less transmissible pathogen, so down here, then the risk of a major epidemic is much, much smaller. So this is the standard approximation. This is the one that policymakers use. However, there's a slight problem with this. And the problem with this is that it makes an assumption about how long individuals are infectious for. So in particular, it makes the assumption that you can be infectious for a very, very long period of time. So for 25 to 30 days, you can also be infectious for a very, very short period of time. So the assumption underlying the standard estimate is that some individuals in the population recover after just 1 day. And that's absolutely not true for something like Ebola. So we took data from the ongoing epidemic. We showed that this kind of distribution characterizes how long people are infectious for much more accurately. So in fact, most individuals are infectious for between about 5 and 10 days. And so we looked at correcting the standard estimate for the risk posed by Ebola outbreaks. And so something like this, the red dotted line is in fact a more accurate approximation for the risk posed by Ebola epidemics. And this is an important result because it shows that Ebola flare-ups when Ebola arrives in a new place is much more likely than was previously thought. And so what that means is that policymakers shouldn't just focus on controlling established outbreaks. They should also focus on predicting where the virus is likely to go and then trying to stamp down on the virus whenever it arrives in a new place. So that's some work that we've been doing recently. Like I said, I was going to talk, I guess this is perhaps slightly more relevant to some of the work that's going to be talked about in this conference. Like I said, this is a talk, this is a project that we're just starting. In fact, we've just been producing results for the last couple of weeks, but I'll show you some of those. And so it's about the effect of climate change on the major outbreak risk. And climate change is known to affect the dynamics of lots and lots of infectious disease outbreaks. So this is one example that was in the news recently. This is black Sigatoka disease of banana, as you can see. So it's a fungus and it affects banana plants. Obviously you can see that this banana plant isn't very happy. So we're not focusing on plant diseases, so we're focusing instead on vector-borne diseases of humans. And something that's been found recently is that climate variables, so variables like temperature and humidity, have a really massive impact on vector populations. So what you can see in this graph down the bottom is that there's kind of a sweet spot for adult mosquitoes. The adult mosquitoes survive best if the temperature is between about 20 and 30 degrees Celsius. And so the stuff that Jim and I and 2 of our collaborators have been doing has been looking at taking the NCAR climate model. So taking forecasts coming out of that climate model, using those to predict variables like temperature and humidity, and then consequently looking at how long vectors are likely to survive, so how long mosquitoes are likely to survive under different temperatures going forwards. So what we can do is we can take those temperatures and then nest those in an ecological model describing how mosquito populations change. And then obviously when there are lots and lots of mosquitoes, then what that means is that a pathogen is going to be very highly transmissible because there are lots of vectors to take the pathogen from one human host to another. And so what we're doing is we're taking those predictions of the numbers of vectors and using that to infer pathogen transmissibility, so making a prediction about pathogen transmissibility. And then when we know about pathogen transmissibility, we can link that back to the stuff that I was showing you early on. So we can link that back to assess the risk posed by a pathogen when it first arrives in a new location. And so at times in future when there's a very high pathogen transmissibility, that suggests that the risk posed by an emerging outbreak is also going to be much, much higher. So like I said, this is work from just the last couple of weeks, but this is something that we're looking at working on going forwards. And so just to summarize then, so obviously my father's career has been very, very inspirational in the career choices that I've made, even though I didn't end up going into solar physics, embarrassingly, perhaps. So instead I work on mathematical modeling of infectious disease outbreaks, including assessing the risk posed by emerging outbreaks. And we've been trying to amend the sort of standard estimates for the major outbreak risk to look at a range of different scenarios, including, as I just explained at the end, climate change. And I'm in absolutely no doubt, as I said before, that this collaboration that we've just started is one that certainly wouldn't have started without my dad. So I'd just like to say thanks. Thanks again for the opportunity to give the talk. Thanks for arranging this amazing tribute to my dad's life and his scientific career. And yeah, thank you very much.
Now tell us, what was your dad really like?
Well, I mean, I think, yeah, I think everything that's been said is yeah, maybe we didn't know everything that everyone has told us, perhaps. But no, it's been really touching to hear everything that everyone's said to us and all the amazing messages that we've been sent over the last 11 months. It's been amazing. But yeah, we didn't necessarily recognize all of it. I'm not sure about the good sense of humor, but everyone says it, so very, very strange.
Good. Well, thank you very much. And we'll have a chance to talk with you over lunch and
Sounds great.
over the reception the next few days.
Thanks.
We have just an announcement from Frank Hill, briefly. And here's a mic.
So as you know, Mike was a big supporter of Gong. Well, we are trying to get a follow-on for Gong now, called NG Gong at the moment, the next generation Gong. We are having a meeting on the requirements for helioseismology on this Thursday in room 3131 from 2 to 4 p.m. And then there's another meeting on Friday over at NSO about other aspects of the new network, which would not just be for helioseismology, be more focused on space weather, but will definitely have a helioseismology component with it. If you cannot make it on Thursday afternoon or Friday, tomorrow at lunch, I will have a small discussion about what is happening in case you can't make it Thursday. Thank you.
So we'll have a coffee break now, and please go over and start to view the posters as well. Pick up some coffee and head over. And we'll reconvene at 10:45. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much also.